First of all, I will give you an introduction on HBA, so the European Gaming and Betting Association. We are a Brussels-based trade association which represents the major online gambling and betting operators, which are established, licensed, and regulated within the European Union. HBA works proactively with national and European authorities and other stakeholders in maintaining and creating regulated online gambling markets in the countries, which aim to provide both a high level of consumer protection, but also consider the digital reality of today's situation. What GBA does is therefore to advocate and on behalf of the European online gaming sector in various platforms like this one on SBSC, for example. We also share information on the online gambling sector, which can be information coming from the regulatory authority or also from our members, or just news about the sector. And finally, we want to promote industry cooperation and leadership, trying to bring the sector to higher standards. Like, for example, using codes of conduct. We have this one for data protection, but we also have one on responsible advertising. We have 5 members, which are Bet365, Betson, GVC, Kindred, and William Hill, which Daniel is part of. And our members have licenses in 20 European countries and account for a total of 16.5 million customers. Combined, they represent 25% of the European online sector. Now, some background on our code. The code has been prepared in accordance with Article 40 of the GDPR. This article states that national authorities, the European Data Protection Board, the European Commission, shall encourage the drafting and using of sectoral codes of conduct to support the proper application of the GDPR. Because of this, we had this idea as a responsibility initiative of the sector to improve data protection standards and to bring them to a certain level for all the sector. So we decided to draft this code. To do this, we created a working group composed by the data protection officers and their teams of the EGBA members. And also on the draft code, we had a public consultation that went through January and February of this year. And after the comments received by stakeholders interested, we also carried out an independent third-party review of the code by a law firm. And then we published the code. First of all, for the scope, the code applies to all EGBA members currently, and is open to the adherence of any other online gambling operator. It will cover all the processing of personal data of players in the online gambling sector, but it doesn't cover the company-employee relationship in the company themselves, and it doesn't cover any offline activities. And of course, the code, when approved, will be legally binding for all the European and EEA countries, of course, always for the signatories. But it's possible for any online gambling company that is not part of the EEA, for example, now in the UK, to nonetheless adhere to our code. To adhere, as we said, any other gambling operators, no member of EGBA, can adhere upon an administration fee that will be used to cover the monitoring costs of the code, because the code needs an independent third-party monitoring body to be enforced. We'll come back to this later. And as EGBA, we also invited national gambling associations to endorse the code and to encourage their members to sign up to it. For now, the Dutch association did it already. And finally, it has to be considered that the code is not a fixed document, but a living one, and will be further developed over time, both because of possible legislative and technological developments in the data protection framework, but also because when we go to apply the code in practice, we can see that maybe there are certain problems arising. As you may know, adhering to a code of conduct that has been approved per the GDPR is helpful in demonstrating the company's compliance with the GDPR itself, and it's taken into account by the data protection authorities when they decide to enforce actions or sanctions for breaching the GDPR. So it's already useful in this way for companies. And it also has three objectives. The first one is to provide guidance to gambling companies on how to apply the GDPR. This is because any country has different gambling laws, different licensing requirements, which sometimes may collide with the GDPR. So this can be some useful guidance. Another objective is to help customers trust against the use of their data, and to improve transparency on how their data is used, because we know from the media that when a company loses the data or there is a breach of personal data of their customers, they first take a reputational hit even before the financial one. And finally, this is a pan-European initiative that tries to assist online gambling companies in achieving a harmonized application of the GDPR, always taking into account the specificities of the online gambling sector, as it's already one of the aims of the GDPR itself. Now with the approval process, we submitted this code in June to the Maltese Data Protection Authority, which is called the Office for Information and Data Protection Commissioner, for its formal approval. We decided to submit the code to the Maltese because this code is a transnational one, because it will be applied in multiple member states. So the approval process is a bit more complicated. First of all, a maximum of 2 other data protection authorities will assist the IDPC and co-review the code with them. After this, the IDPC will submit the code to the European Data Protection Board, which is the European body that deals with data protection at the European level. This body will issue an opinion saying whether this code complies with the GDPR and can be approved. And finally, the Maltese authority will take into account this opinion and decide whether the code will be approved or not. This process is estimated to last 18 to 24 months, but we don't really know. It depends from the workload of the Maltese and the other data protection authorities on if we have to redraft certain parts of the code, or if, for example, now, let's say the code is not high priority because of the coronavirus and maybe other related issues. Finally, for the monitoring and enforcement, as I said before, we need a third-party monitoring body. The code contains in itself some clear requirements which are mandatory for the signatories, and some best practice requirements which are not mandatory. This is because when drafting the code, we have to take into account the possibilities of small and medium operators to join the code. So we decided to put the strict test requirements as something not mandatory, because we didn't want to create problems and hinder the possibilities for other operators to join the code, and maybe they would need to implement some costly things to comply with the code. The monitoring of the compliance, so with these requirements, will be assigned to this independent third-party monitoring body. We are in contact with one, and this will need to be accredited by the Maltese Data Protection Authority and certified. After the code will be approved, it will be legally binding and so enforced against its signatories. This concludes my part of the presentation. If you have any question, we can take them later. Otherwise, we can go on with Daniel's presentation.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen first. Oh, it won't let me. The host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, so I can share yours for you. One moment. Okay. Yes. Voila, can you see it?
Yes.
Voila.
Okay, very briefly, because we're trying to leave as much room as we can for questions at the end. Can you go back, Daniel?
Yes.
Just to introduce myself, my name's Daniel Chapman. For those of you who don't know me, I'm currently the DPO for William Hill International and Mr. Green, both of which form part of the overall William Hill Group, which you'll be more familiar with, possibly depending on where you are in the world, than those other two brands. I've done this for 20 years. I enjoy doing it. I don't want to do anything else. And when I had the opportunity to work with Egbert on this code, I jumped at it because I really think it's worthwhile. And that's what I'm going to try and talk to you about today. The last thing I'll say before getting into it is a standard disclaimer. I'm here today as myself. Nothing I say is representative of the opinions or intentions of my company. I have to say that. So there we are, it's said. Next slide, sir. I'm not going to read each slide to you because by the time I get through one bullet point, you've already scanned the whole document. But what I am going to do is just pick out something on each slide that I think is particularly important or good about what the code is doing. And I'm going to jump straight in with a contentious issue. The first bullet point, data maps. Yes, it's true. I can't point at a section of the GDPR that mandates data maps. It isn't there. However, we took the opinion when we were building the code that a lot of things recommend having one, and it makes common sense because if you don't know what data you've got and you don't know where that data is, then you can't possibly conduct a satisfactory risk assessment on that data. And we all know the nightmare situation. It really happens. There's a server in a cupboard which is still on and nobody even remembers it's there. A filing cabinet that gets discovered and it's full of personal data, maybe HR files. So doing the data map encourages people to dig these things out and document them and maybe destroy half of them that have been there for 100 years for no purpose. So you can also use it to help you purge those old files. What the code doesn't do, although it mandates having one, is tell you how complicated it must be, what tools to use. It doesn't mandate some fancy thing which is going to be beyond the reach of most companies to buy. This could be anything from an Excel spreadsheet to an Access database to one of those fancy tools. It's up to you to decide how granular it is, how big it is, and to what level of detail it needs to go. As long as you can hand on heart say, we know what data we've got and where it is, then that's the end goal here. Next slide, please. And talking about the end goal, it's really important to think of it like that, because what this code is a common destination. We're all going to get there in different ways, as long as those ways are compliant with the code. And as Danielle said, we've left room for different solutions with different budgets, etc., etc. As long as we all take that journey and arrive at that same place, that's what's important. The journey will only ever be assessed based on the realities of the member company that's being assessed at that moment. You'll never be compared to anybody else or what somebody else did. On this slide, I just want to pick out data portability, an issue that's relatively simple on the surface, but when we were throwing ideas about around how we would make portability work, what came out was that one operator would never want from the sender, if you like, the receiver would never want all of the information that the sender would have to disclose under data portability. And that creates two problems. The operator sending the data would have spent time, money, resources in gathering all of that information. And the receiver is now faced with having a lot of information that they won't use, didn't want, didn't ask for, but now it's their responsibility to get rid of it in a secure manner. So what we're proposing, and it will be doable if the code is approved, is that with the customer's consent, one operator can talk directly to the other operator where the customer would like their data to go and figure out the most efficient way to get that done. So we're only sending the data that the other party wants to receive. Saves us time, saves their problem of having data they don't want. It all gets done faster for the customer. So everybody wins, and yet we're achieving what the customer wants to achieve. So it's a slight twist on the technically precise interpretation of the portability right. We're not taking that away from the customer. They still have that if they want it, but we're trying to get to what the benefit is in that right for the customer in a better way. Next slide, please. On this slide, I want to talk about the DPAs, the relationship of the data protection authorities or supervisory authorities. In the code, we've been quite bold around this. The GDPR and even the guidance documents from the European Data Protection Board, they talk about the concept of a one-stop shop. So nominating a lead supervisory authority through which the complaints will be handled and who you develop the closest relationship with. But at no point do they really lay out any mandatory rules about that. So you don't have to do it. You don't have to document it. You don't have to publicize it. And our view was no, we'd like to be more granular than that. So what we've said is that you do have to pick one. If you're a multinational throughout Europe company, you have to pick where your main establishment is. You have to use that to choose your lead supervisory authority, data protection authority, and you must document that. We haven't said you have to publish it, but internally, at the very least, it must be documented to prove that it's been decided. And the thinking behind that is that it's all about customer trust. It would prevent jurisdiction shopping. So the moment you do this, you decide it, you write it down, it's mandatory. You can't push any court case around the world until you hit a jurisdiction that suits your purposes. We've all heard of major multinationals doing this. So this is one of the elements, one of the tiny bits of it which build up to make a picture where we're trying to say, trust us with your data. We're prepared to be open, transparent. We're not trying to play clever with any of this. Next slide. I'm not going to talk about these at all. I'm going to leave them there so you can see them. I'm going to talk about the idea behind putting them in the code. The reason for that is I want you to read the code. If I talk through these case studies, you won't have to. But the idea of these case studies is they're sector specific. They were created by a group of operators for a group of operators. They are the problems that we all said we face every day. They are the areas of the Act that we all said were difficult to interpret. So we tried to fix that. We tried to actually give you a document you could pick up, and heaven forbid, you might actually find an answer to your question, as opposed to a case study about a mechanic, which you then have to try and apply to profiling risky gambling behavior. Here are some more ones: problem areas, direct marketing, fraud detection, and the use of automated decision-making versus solely automated decision-making, all mixed together with the concept of how transparent can you be about that, because being transparent, which we have to be by law, would defeat the purpose, because people would then learn to circumvent it. So take that whole mess and try and work through it. And that's the kind of case study that you'll find in the code. And that's it. That's as much as I want to say, because I'm here for your questions. This is me. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn. That's absolutely fine. I'll always respond. And